was the last time you needed someone's help and you were so glad they were there? Maybe you or a loved one had a medical emergency, and so you went to the emergency room or to urgent care, and you were so glad for the medical professionals that were there. Maybe your computer hard drive crashed, and you were so glad for an IT person who could help you out and get you back up and running again. Maybe your car broke down, and you were so glad for a mechanic who could help you get back on the road again. Here's a question I have for you. Do you understand how important you are? See, in my mind, if you're watching this, you're a linchpin leader. Let me tell you what I mean by that. This little thing right here is a linchpin, and it holds things weighing thousands of pounds in place. It keeps mechanisms and things running. It's an incredibly important piece. And here's what I believe. I believe in this thing called the local church. You play an incredibly vital role. So important is your role, and yet I think sometimes we downplay it. A church leader I know was invited to a state dinner at the White House. And while they were there, they were actually seated next to a general. And the general that night had a couple of glasses of wine to drink and apparently was feeling like they wanted to go into kind of a confessional mode. And so they began to share with this church leader some of the things of their past. And one of the things they shared was some horrific things that had happened during the Vietnam War, and actually some decisions that this general had made that had cost many people their lives. And you could tell in that conversation that this general felt just really badly. They felt horrific about the decisions they had made. And later on that evening, when that state dinner was over, the general stood up and looked across the table at this church leader and said, "Look, I don't know who you are or what you do, but be really glad that you don't hold the lives of men and women in your hands, because in the military, it's all about life and death." Well, this church leader went back across the street to where they were staying in their hotel, and they pondered about that conversation they had had with the general. And here's what struck them. They said, "You know, General," this is what they said in their spirit, "You know, General, it is true. What you do is incredibly important, and the lives of men and women are in your hands. But what we do in the local church is actually even more important. Because in the military, you're dealing with the mortal lives of men and women. And in the church, we're dealing with the eternal destinies of men and women, where they will spend eternity." Now, here's what I find interesting. If you wanted to become a medical doctor, it would take you anywhere between 11 and 15 years to learn how to practice that trade well, to be a great surgeon, if you will. If you wanted to practice law, it would take you about 7 or 8 years to go through the training of learning how to do that well. If you wanted to be a veterinarian, typically it takes about 8 years to go through the training to treat animals or pets really well. And yet, when it comes to the most vital organization on the face of the planet, this thing that we call the local church, often there's little or no training whatsoever for those who serve in those linchpin leadership positions. I find that fascinating. In other words, what happens quite often is that we get elected to serve, and the next thing we know, we're actually serving on the local board or on the board of elders or on the lead team, whatever we call our governing body, and we haven't been trained at all. So what we want to do in this series of linchpin leadership is we just want to come alongside of you and do our best to add value to you so that you can be the very best leaders you can possibly be as you provide leadership in your local church.
What happens when a church board is not operating well? We've all heard nightmare stories. We know what that's like when a board kind of goes off the rails. And we won't do all that drama right now, but let me tell you what's really, really common. Something that happens in a lot of churches, and that's when agendas trump alignment. And it comes from a kind of an innocent place, well, sometimes about as innocent as the Crusades, but it does come from a good heart where it comes from an advocacy model. And where that means, each person on the board is kind of a representative of each ministry in the church. And what happens, though, is they start tending to protect the ministry and fight for the ministry and defend the ministry. And it often can start to skew how decisions are made or where money goes, and it can get really political really quickly. For example, I remember a church I was consulting, And the two most powerful guys on the board, the two most influential guys on the board, had each an individual ministry. One guy was influential and had a lot of money, another guy was just really influential with people. And one of the guys was sort of the advocate. He loved the student ministry. And the other guy loved the music and worship ministry. And it got to be such a deal. It was so combative and full of conflict that the board was literally split because of these two influencers. They almost split the church. You'd have thought it was the Holy Crusades.
Let's think for just a moment about what happens when a governing body, a group of linchpin leaders, comes together in a room and functions really well together. Well, first of all, lost people get found. Found people grow up into everything that Jesus created them to be. Communities are transformed by the gospel as His kingdom comes and His will is done in that community. When linchpin leaders come together in a room and operate really well together, there's no personal agendas. There's no elephants in the room, if you will. There's no taboo topics. You share together and are able to work together seamlessly. It's awesome. Also, you come together and you pray the same prayer that Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane when He said, "Father, not my will be done, but your will be done." So again, there are no personal agendas. What you really want to do is discern God's will. That's what happens when a group of people comes together and serves well together as linchpin leaders. Now, I know it's not fun, but let me go to the flip side of that. What happens when linchpin leaders come together and they don't understand their role and they don't function well together? Well, I got to tell you, I really do believe this. Lost people don't get found, and therefore they don't grow up into all that Jesus created them to be. Communities are not transformed by the gospel. Marriages are not saved. People who are addicts do not break their addictions because they never find out about the power of the gospel. So many things don't happen in a community that could happen if we were acting in a healthy way as linchpin leaders. Not only that, but personal agendas rule in the boardroom. You can just tell it. There are people that just have their things that they want, and it's going to happen no matter what. That's what they're focused in on. Instead of praying, "Father, not my will, but your will be done," they never say this, but really what they're saying is, "Father, my will be done." And so linchpin leaders in that scenario never get to experience the sweet community that God wants us to experience as we serve together in this wonderful adventure called the local church that Jesus came to start. So that's what it can mean to serve as a linchpin leader. That's what I want for you. And now in this first video, I just want to talk about a couple of things that we can do to be linchpin leaders, to be the very best leaders we can possibly be in this role. The first thing I want to talk about is providing spiritual leadership in the life of our local church. I don't mean to make this uncomfortable for you, but I got to tell you, you help set the tone in your local church for the spiritual atmosphere that church is going to have. You set the lid, if you will, for spiritual maturity. So what that means is that we've got to make sure that our relationship with Christ is vibrant and alive, that we're spending time with Him on a daily basis. The Apostle Paul, when he was talking to his young protege, Timothy, in 1 Timothy, he talks to him about this very subject. As a matter of fact, let's look at it together. Set an example for the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, and in purity. The ongoing desire of our hearts should be, how can we walk with Jesus? In John chapter 15, Jesus gave us this great analogy, this great word picture of what it means to walk with God the Father. This is what He said: "Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must remain in the vine. And neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." One of the things I like to ask myself about every 6 months is my relationship with Jesus Christ closer now than it was 6 months ago? Am I displaying more of the fruits of the Spirit now more than I was 6 months ago? Am I listening for and responding to promptings of the Holy Spirit more now than again I was 6 months ago? Am I filled with the character of Christ more now? And again, the goal here is not to have a case of the guilties or to walk around self-condemned. Not at all. The goal is just to check in with my soul and ask myself on a fairly regular basis, am I walking with Jesus in a way that's setting an example for other people who I'm trying to serve and lead and love? I just think that's a key thing for us to do. Now, in the book of 1 Timothy chapter 3 and in Titus chapter 1, the Apostle Paul gives us some other things that are really key when it comes to linchpin leaders, and you should study that. I would encourage you to do so. And also in this series, we're going to look at some other key components of being linchpin leaders, what we need to bring to the table, if you will. One more thing I want to offer here comes right out of the Bible. It actually comes out of James and Paul's letter to the Colossians. In James chapter 1, verse 5, this is what James says. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 9, Paul writes, we continually ask God to fill you with the knowledge of His will through all the wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives. Linchpin leaders recognize that they need God's help. They need God's wisdom if they're going to do the work that Jesus has called them to do in a way that will honor Him.
So what happens in a church when the church board is operating really well? I love that question. I think the answer is kind of straightforward and simple. God moves and solves problems. I think even the best leadership, the best boards, the best strategy, the best men and women who are serving on the board, you just can't fix everything. It's just, God, you just sometimes got to stop what you're doing, leave the whole board thing and go to God. I remember many years back, we were at a board meeting here at 12 Stone Church, and it was 10 o'clock at night, and our hearts were burdened. We were looking for something different in our high school ministry. We were looking for the next pastor to be here to shepherd and lead the high school ministry. And it was just going nowhere, and we just stopped. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and we left the boardroom, we left the building, we went outside, we went into the auditorium where the students meet. And I remember we just called upon God. We just called heaven down for, it must have been an hour. We walked the place, we walked the chairs, we talked to God, we begged God and said, would you do something that we can't do? And I gotta tell you, He did so much more than we could have ever done. He brought this young man named Kevin, and he became one of the most extraordinary student pastors we've ever had. So much so that we asked him to become our first campus pastor, our second campus, and so much so even further, he became the number 2 teaching pastor for the entirety of 12 Stone Church. That happened because we just left the leadership aside, we left the strategies aside, we left the boardroom, went to God and said, would you help us? And look what He did.
You are a linchpin leader. You play a vital role in the growth and vibrancy and health of this thing called the local church. I just want to say thank you to you for your willingness to serve in this capacity. And my prayer is that over these remaining 3 sessions, we can work together to add value to your life so that you can serve with great joy and with great effectiveness. Thanks a lot.